All right, welcome everybody. I have 1:02 Central Time here in Chicago, so we're going to go ahead and get underway. Although I expect other folks to filter in as we start things off here. I just want to welcome everyone to today's discussion. I am Greg Yao, the president of the Center for Research Libraries. And one quick housekeeping item, today's conversation is being recorded, and we will share out a recording of today's conversation afterwards. I also want to introduce the series. Today's conversation is part of a longer series, the Diversity as Knowledge series, that is being organized and hosted by the CRL International Collections and Content Committee. This is the second conversation in that series, building on the first kickoff talk by Dr. Reggie Raju last April, which was on expunging bias, reengineering the knowledge ecosystem. It was a really terrific talk, and that it generated a lot of energy and conversation across the CRL community. And to kick off today's talk, I'm going to hand things over to Lori Taylor, the Senior Director for Library Technology and Digital Strategies at the University of Florida. Lori is a member of the CRL International Collections and Content Group and is actively working on the Diversity as Knowledge series, which will culminate in the CRL annual meeting here in Chicago on April 27th and 28th, which will be an on-site gathering that will continue reflections on the theme of diversity as knowledge. And with that, I hand it over to you, Lori.
Thanks so much, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Lori Taylor. Thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks to the International Collections and Contents Group's sub-team for working on organizing the virtual gatherings. The group includes Esmeralda Kale at Northwestern, Emily Sangaloo at the University of Wisconsin, and Brian Vivier at the University of Pennsylvania. Our team brainstormed on folks doing the most creative, impactful, and brilliant work, and folks who are leaders. We were so excited to get to invite Dr. Schuyler Esprit, who's a luminary and a powerhouse, to present with us. Now it's a great honor to introduce Dr. Schuyler Esprit, who's the founder and director of the Create Caribbean Research Institute, which is the first digital humanities center in the Caribbean. She's one of the leaders on the recently awarded $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation for the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective. She holds a PhD in English literature at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's also taught and held professional positions at a number of universities in and outside of the United States. And as a scholar of Caribbean literary and cultural studies, her research areas of interest include Caribbean literary and cultural studies, environmental and ecological humanities, and digital humanities. Dr. Esprit continues to write and publish on Caribbean literature, including on the impact of reading in communities and real and virtual spaces. Her book, Imprinted: The Social History of Caribbean Reading, is forthcoming with Papalote Press. So now over to you, Dr. Esprit.
Thanks so much, Lori, and thank you to CRL, to Greg and Lori and the team for thinking of me, for inviting me to this. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me, and that we can make it accessible for others if there is a feature for transcription, so people can access that. I'm not sure if that's possible. Yes, so thanks again for inviting me to deliver this talk today. This is quite an exciting time to be thinking about diversity as knowledge, and I am really excited to share some stories with you. I mentioned to Greg and Lori when I was invited that it was sort of perfect timing that I wanted to find a place to write and talk about some recent experiences I've had since our grant news, and this was sort of the perfect venue for that. I will begin by sharing my screen and welcoming you to the talk with my slides. Let's get that set up. I will say that we're going to have a bit of interaction at some point here, so please look forward to that. This is going to be more like a class session than a regular talk, which is more my style. I will do some reading, but there will be some interventions throughout. Okay, so I'm talking today about the right to serendipity, unlikely scenes of Caribbean knowledge production. When I was an undergraduate student at Brooklyn College in New York City, My first and only job was at the college library. It was a dream job in many respects. I was psyched that I would be able to get all my work done while I was at work. This was a big deal for a college student. That I would be able to browse and read everything while on the job as well. I was an 18-year-old avid reader who had moved to the United States a couple months before, and the magnitude of the library was larger than any space for reading that I had encountered in my life thus far. My high school had a small library, a part of an open classroom with books we could read and borrow. The Roseau Public Library, the main branch of our National Library and Information System, was a beautifully designed colonial era building with a large courtyard, donated by Andrew Carnegie and built in 1907 to make reading material free to the public, most recently emancipated people of African descent, their children and grandchildren. That library only had 2 rooms with books for circulation, the children's room and the adult borrowing and reference room. The volume of material I dreamed I would encounter at Brooklyn College Library was beyond my imagination. In my time in the US thus far, the only other expanses of books I had experienced were in bookstores with endless titles, new and old, that as a broke international student, I would never be able to afford, but always attempt to buy. But when I was hired at the college library, nothing was like I imagined. At the time, the library was relocated to the athletics building because of renovations and expansions to the historic building with a traditional clock tower overlooking the quad. I was also first hired to work in administration, not where I thought I would be. I was processing timesheets and payroll and leave requests and not doing anything whatsoever with books. I was very quietly disappointed in the no windows clerical office in the gym where I did not get to spend any quality time with books. Fast forward, I worked at the library until my graduation 4 years later. And I will just try to move my slides along. When I left for graduate school, I was shift supervisor for the circulation and reserve section on nights and weekends. I worked full-time in the summer of 2002 to help us relocate back to the main library, beautiful with its new and old sections, floor-to-ceiling windows on the staircase that overlooked the famous Lily Pond outside. In the heart of the city and bustling Brooklyn, you could enter the library and be completely swept away to another quieter place. In fact, I often did, finally working across various units to find the quiet spots, the good books, the special collections, and the time to read anything I want. So I have a few pictures here of the contrast of the Brooklyn College Library with our library in Dominica in Roseau. Although BC Library was a smaller research library connected to the CUNY system and the larger New York consortium, I did learn so much there that would shape my appreciation for the work and impact of libraries and the diversity with which we may engage these spaces for the good of community. Much of what I learned was to be able to take on a role of creative and intellectual leadership at Create Caribbean was from there, and at all other institutions where I've worked and collaborated have been a result of my exposure to a variety of spaces for thinking, collaborating, and engaging with history and our current reality in the context of that college library. It was in the special collections there I first learned that school was also known as the Red Schoolhouse, known for its assumed affiliation with the Communist Party of America, but mostly for its student activism against censorship and fearmongering of the McCarthy era that forced many marginalized artists and writers, particularly Black artists, into silence or across the Atlantic to Europe to continue their work and advocacy for civil and human rights. It was there that I found out that Paula Marshall, a young student originally from Barbados, was heavily involved in these fights for justice before she would go on to write many novels set in the Caribbean or with the image of her Caribbean home in mind. I am indebted to the space and experience of the BC Library, but more importantly, the many fortunate and surprise circumstances that led me from freshman year in a new country to this moment where I end up here talking to you about research and knowledge production in the Caribbean. The series theme, Diversity as Knowledge, asked me to consider the full circle of my professional life in this moment. The chance and circumstance that led me to New York, a young immigrant girl from a small island, to research one universities with bounties of resources, and back to the small island where it all began. This time, that small Carnegie Library rendered useless by hurricanes and neglect. For this occasion, I want to explore how, in the absence of spaces that many of us in this audience take for granted, does knowledge making, life making happen, and how? Excuse me, I have some background noise. Arjuna Padarai, the anthropologist and scholar of globalization, offers us a way to think about research as a specialized name for a generalized capacity. The capacity to make disciplined inquiries into those things that we need to know but do not know yet. Padarai proposes that despite the ways that the concept and practice of research has been dominated and funded by higher education and specialized labs and centers, the reality or ideal is that research should be served always as a public good. And the people who benefit from research are not only the most vulnerable subjects of our society. For what he amounts to, about 30% of the population, quote, who get past elementary education, but not beyond secondary education, they are within the framework of global knowledge societies. For this group, however, he notes that their existence in this category is insecure for many reasons, including partial education, inadequate social capital or connectivity, political weakness, and economic insecurity. This describes a great number of people who live in the communities on the island where I'm from and the other islands of the Caribbean, other countries of the Caribbean as well. In proposing the right to research, what Padarai also asserts is that communities in the Global South not only have the right, but also possess the capacity to aspire to disciplined inquiry, to ask questions, to investigate, identify problems, and produce solutions all on their own, independent of or adjacent to the specialized research formations taking place within their communities and sometimes about their lives, right? Padarai asks us to think about how their rights include them being capable of claiming this right to research, the right to the tools through which any citizen can systemically increase the stock of knowledge through which they consider most vital to their survival as human beings and to their claims as citizens. In other words, it is not us to up the formal researchers, the scholars, the librarians to determine what research is good research for communities. It is up to those communities to set the agendas for themselves. When I dreamed up Create Caribbean Research Institute in 2014, I certainly did not have this idea about the right to research in mind. The only right to research I thought about was my own, a privilege. But this is the thing about serendipity. Sometimes the lessons come to you. I read this essay while preparing for a collaboration with my colleague at the University of London Goldsmiths. But before I tell you about this particular essay, I want to stop and say that Create Caribbean was a very fortunate accident that happened with my friend at a bar. I've told this story a number of times. I wanted to do many things for myself, to start a new career somewhere in the Caribbean after feeling that I had quit my job and moved away. And I sat at a bar with my friend and with another friend on the phone, and Create Caribbean happened. So for all the things that I wanted to do in that moment was research, formal research about Caribbean people of all kinds as a scholar and a very newly minted PhD. It didn't work out that way. It worked out even better, but the principle is the same. My blind spot and my privilege, even in that dream, even in that fortunate accident of a conversation, was really about applying a formalized process to a circumstance and a set of local knowledges from which I was essentially still an outsider, even though this was my home. And I had to learn a lot about how to navigate that space and how to reconcile my training with my sense of citizenship, with my own desires to make a home for myself back where I was from. But fast forward a few years later, I had read this essay with my friend Adam, who is an anthropologist at the University of London Goldsmiths, as part of our preparation for the Caribbean Cyclone Cartography Project, where we worked to document how people in Dominica were experiencing the aftermath of a Category 5 Hurricane Maria in 2017. That project forced us to be extremely mindful of the ethics of care with which we approach the research. Both the ethnography and digital storytelling since we were dealing with trauma survivors, our subjects, and many of us ourselves, the researchers. I was guided by the idea that in their right to research, our participants would tell us the direction the study would take. They would tell us when enough was enough. They would tell us what they wanted us to know. Essentially, the process of the Surviving Storms project was that our participants were setting and leading the terms of engagement. What they wanted to know themselves, what they thought would be useful for their neighbors, and what they thought would be good to share with a specialized audience to further help their cause and communities. What I learned through that experience helped me to remember and reframe my purpose and values for the work at Create Caribbean as we entered a new season. Recently, Create Caribbean, as Laurie mentioned, benefited from a Mellon Foundation grant as part of the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective. This grant came after years of sustained work in teaching, research, and community engagement within Dominica and across the region and diaspora, most of the time with little to no funding. Create Caribbean's origin story reminds me of the gym library at Brooklyn College, underwhelming resources in rooms not fit for purpose. And yet, my goal is to bring Create Caribbean history and heritage to college students in the form of dreaming, experimentation, and digital scholarship were always about this sense of serendipity. We will use what we have, usually very little, and see where we end up. And that has always worked, whether as a teaching or learning tool or as a pathway to civic engagement. Fast forward 8 years, where we ended up was with a bounty of resources of our own and the opportunity to expand our programs and extend our reach by growing the student internship program, where we focus on formal research skills, digital scholarship, and collaborative learning. The grant also allowed for a training intensive program in the summer for community organizations and public-facing agencies to get some of the skills that our students learned and to apply them to their programs or advocacy. Serendipity struck again, and a couple of months into the grant period, which began this January, so we're only, 10 months in now, I had conversations with members of the literary community with which I have been active for some time. These conversations helped me think through a long-time dream I had to expand that community in Dominica and the region with a focus on novice and emerging writers. One thing led to another, and I was making revisions to our goals and budget to form what is now the Community Partners Program, a more holistic support system that I intimated but could not articulate within the constraints of admin work, grant deadlines, and running an institution myself. Okay. Second. Let's see. So I am going to do my show and tell, which I love to tell people about. Here's what happened as a result of that. I said that I had to have a little bit of, let me just try to share my screen. I'm having a little technical glitch with my document here. Can everyone see my screen? No? All right. Can you see my screen now? Yes, great, thank you. All right, I couldn't see them for a second. I don't know where they went to. All right, so the Create Caribbean expansion program, as I mentioned, allowed us under the grant to develop a Caribbean Digital Studies certificate, which is essentially a minor in Caribbean Digital Studies for students at Dominica State College, which is a national college primarily with 2-year associate degree programs and some 4-year programs. And so this is a 12 to 15 credit program with which essentially serves as a program minor. The program began in 2016 as an academic, with academic credits at Dominica State College. Before that, students were basically doing volunteer work without necessarily any type of academic coursework attached to it. Since 2016, they have been getting some credit, and now it's a formal certificate program. We also included in that certificate program are self-paced learning courses on areas from computational methods to archiving and ethics, to Caribbean studies and the general themes of Caribbean studies. Students will also develop research portfolios as part of their work. And then we also have them working after their training in the courses with apprenticeship for community partners. The new community partners program includes the summer intensive training, which is about 8 to 10 days of intense work, which I will show in a second. Resource sharing and mentorship, and support from interns to continue project work. So the interns will be placed at the organizations and they will continue to support the projects that the organizations wanted to produce. They will get grant writing support to apply for the CDSC micro grants and other opportunities. And there will be monthly meetings on workshops on needs-based topics, things that are important to the community organizers, to the organizations. And all of those things are working in a cycle of digital humanities work, research, community engagement, and social justice. All of the are in a symbiotic relationship between the internship program and the community partners program. And this is sort of the highlight of the of what the grant has allowed us to do in terms of connecting what for me is the future of the Caribbean, my teaching and learning with college students, to the work in progress, the work in real time with the communities that have the right to research and require the resources to support that work. So now begins what I call the show and tell segment of my talk, where I tell you how I spent my summer workation. And we will look specifically at the 2-week summer intensive training as an example of how that research, that right to research and the serendipity effect takes place in real time in that context. So one of the things we wanted to do with this particular program was to invite for the first year. The grant runs from 2022 to 2025. It's a 4-year grant period. And one of the things I wanted to do with the Community Partners Program is reach out to institutions and organizations that have been friendly to Create Caribbean. And by friendly, I really mean in collaboration with us and partnership with us and supporting our efforts in some way from the beginning. We wanted to keep this one to Dominica since we were in our sort of research period of our expansion. And we wanted to also include organizations that were new or needed or had really strong messages and strong possibility of impact and really needed the support and the resources to have that impact be prolonged in the community. And we wanted to address the themes that had already been important to Create Caribbean throughout our time. So of course, literary and cultural studies, we will see, but also youth development work, environmental and sustainability work, education and information literacy, all of those things were important to us. And so at first, the goal was to invite all of these groups to be community partners, which would be for the long haul of the relationship with Create Caribbean, and these organizations all are. But when it came to the summer intensive, as the facilitator for the workshop and the kind of primary mentor for this program, I encountered a bit of a pause. I was like, how am I going to bring all of these organizations together and all of these people from these organizations together and teach them similar things when they are so vastly different? So we're looking at Dominica Library and Information Service, and in our context, that includes the public library, that's circulation and reference material. There are 5 branches in Dominica, and the Rosa Public Library is the main branch. The National Archives, the Documentation Center. The National Archives is one of the richest resources we have in Dominica, and they do a great job. We have some really good librarians working there who do a great effort at both preservation and, knowledge sharing around this information. We have slave registers, manuscripts, an incredible newspaper collection. And then we have the Documentation Center, which is the formal repository for all government and public agency documents, including, well, the Gazette is held at the National Archives, but also the current gazettes are held with the Dunn Documentation Center, as well as a range of other formal documents. You can get any documents you want about agriculture and forestry, to trade and development. This is supposed to be the official repository for government documents, government policy documents, anything related to the public good and the public sector is supposed to be deposited with the Documentation Center for posterity. And then, of course, the National Museum. We have a relatively small museum in Dominica that needs quite a bit of attention and support, and they're also included under the Library and Information Service. We also work with Dominica State College, and particularly Office of the Registrar, which is the record-keeping office of the school, of course. I worked at the Office of the Registrar for a long time, for a couple of years before I left Dominica and moved to another place in the region. And I'm well aware of the resource deficits around not only keeping good records or keeping our records secure, but also keeping the histories or treating this college as worthy of and having an archive of its own. And that's really important to the story as well. It's not just, yes, let's preserve grades and let's preserve student and personal information, but also let's preserve the history of the institution. The Dominica State College is sort of the third iteration of the attempts at tertiary level education in Dominica. And there's a very rich story to tell there about how it became a national college from its very early days when there were separate institutions for teacher training, nursing education, academic training and technical education. So it was very important to include Dominica State College, which is our primary partner, and all our students in our internship program. For those of you who are new to Create Caribbean, are currently from Dominica State College, although we will be expanding to other countries into the new calendar year. The One Seat a Day initiative is a small organization that is very new. I think they're only about a couple years old, and they're very focused on encouraging people to do tree planting and reforestation, as well as and other works related to sustainability and environmentalism, conservation, and those types of issues. And they are a team of maybe two or more. I don't know the total, but they're very two young women who are very active and leading that initiative. And they have done quite a bit of work using social media to spread their message. The Chronicle newspaper is, of course, the longest serving newspaper in Dominica, consecutively serving newspaper in Dominica. This newspaper began in 1909. I was once the editor of this newspaper. We've had a long relationship with them where we've published our work from Create Caribbean and other things there, and they're looking to digitize, preserve, and share much of the archives of the newspaper, including the old issues, but as well as other material related to the operations of the Chronicle for that time period. That's 100 and something years old. I can't do math off the cuff like that. And then, of course, the White Woolly Writers Association, which is a newer institution, is only a few years old in this particular formation. It succeeds many other versions of organizations and attempts to create writing communities in Dominica. We had the Writers Guild of Dominica. We also had the Nature Island Literary Festival, which I was on the committee for and was the chair of for several years. And that many of the members kind of transferred into what is now a more, I would say, holistic and diverse body of people. And this Writers Association is really what prompted me to I had been looking for a way to include work on developing that literary community, like I said, in Dominica, and wanted to do something kind of like what we had in the literary festival, but in a more structured way. And I thought that using digital technology and DH tools would be a great way to re-engage that community without necessarily engaging enduring the costs and some of the challenges as I write. I've finished my book now. I write about some of the challenges and sort of the paradoxes of literary festivals and the public good that they have the capacity to do. And I wanted to address some of those things and put a different format, something that was more wide-reaching, something that was more accessible across class and across skill level. And what we ended up with is a project called the Caribbean Writers Room, which is an extension of the Community Partners Program, but a project all unto its own. And this was the Caribbean Writers Room that really prompted me to extend the Community Partners Program from just the summer intensive training as we had it as a line item in the budget to more structured, holistic program that had continuity over the life of the grant. And I have to say that this is one of the challenges for when you come from a situation where you have no resources and then somebody tells you you have all these resources, even advocating for yourself and saying, oh, I have resources now, I would like to change my mind and do this. It was very scary for me to go back to the grant people and say, can I add this stuff? But I learned that actually I can ask for what I want. And they gave us the money to do this work. And so I made those changes. I got the guts and the gumption and I made the changes. And this is the program that we have now. So I just wanted to highlight, and I want you to observe, this was a group of people who ended up coming to the summer intensive training for the 2-week period. In August, we ran from August 2nd to the 12th. We do have other partners. We Planet is an app, and it's a coalition of student organizations. 3 of the student leaders in that organization were interns at Create Caribbean, and they run an app on conservation and environmentalism as well. It's the We Planet app. You can get it on Google Play or Apple right now. I encourage you to look at it. It's very specific to Dominica, but it has a lot of great information for students. For all people about how we're doing conservation and preservation work in Dominica around engaging our efforts to preserve the planet. And I'm very proud of the students who do that, although they did not attend the training, particularly because they were all trained by me in class and part of the internship program, most of them were. And then also we have the University of the West Indies Mona Department of Literatures and English program, which who are also eligible to take the summer intensive training, but because of the time we onboarded, we did not get representation, but they will be there next year. So we have a variety. We've already started expanding outside of Dominica and in terms of our community partners, and we will see more of that diversity in terms of regional representation in next summer's summer intensive. And so what did we do for the summer? We spent a few days talking about what they wanted to do and what their ideas were about where research comes from and where do good ideas and topics for research come from. And so we started about the relationship between the ideas that they have, the institutions that we occupy, the environment in which we get to work, and the people who we get to work with or for. And that extended our conversation. And the terms you see on the board all over in this sort of mind map that we use with the whiteboard were our ideas of where we might begin thinking about their desire to do research. Many of the people who attended are staff members or young people who are doing this as a cause. We had a high school principal, archives librarian, 2 young men who were just basically library assistants. We had one of the representatives who teaches physics at the college, but is there on behalf of the One Seed a Day initiative. The types of work that they do in their daily life. We have one person who is the records officer. So they are working, most of them work in some type of public service all day or in a professional role, and are people who, again, are the 30% of people who have high school education, sometimes some college education, and don't necessarily have the specialized skills of research or formal education that librarians and academics tend to value or use as a measuring stick of valuable research to contribute to or for those communities. And so I wanted to equip them with the confidence and the assurance that they get to decide what research is valuable to them and how they approach that research. And so we began with this conversation, and then we wanted to talk about something very important to us, community. And that second conversation revolved around whether we view community as people or as places or both, and when and how that those things intersect in our thinking. And so by the end of the first week, what we had was a work plan and timeline of how we wanted to do how they might think about organizing their thinking and their workflows around completing a project. They had to do some brainstorming, they had to do some writing, they had to come with an idea of something they wanted to do for their organization. And every day they came for 8 hours a day. They sat and they thought through things, and they would come back next day and say, okay, now I thought I knew what I was doing, and now my head hurts a little more, and now my head hurts a little more, and my head hurts a little more, but they were actively thinking and doing. And I use this set of slides that I learned from a very, very long time ago. They're very old, and it's talking about project management from digital work on digital preservation, particularly from the University of Florida. The Mathers Library did a training workshop maybe like in 2012, and I still have those slides, and they're very useful and helps me to speak to a wider audience outside of an academic context. And I still employ some of the knowledge from that training to help community organizations to think and feel more empowered about their ability to take on this work. Right. So yes, it was exhausting week, the first week, but we made it. And then they felt stronger about having and writing research proposals that they shared with us in preparation for learning tools in the second week that they would use to do small digital humanities test projects. These were sort of sample baby projects that they wanted something to walk away by the end of the workshop with, that they could do to learn, to test out their theory or to test out their project and see where they would end up after doing some of this research. Now, here it gets fun. Around DH in 8 days, we did a whole semester's worth of work in the second week. So this is technically only about 4 to 5 days of the work that we were able to do, or the tools that I was able to share with them in that summer intensive training. Night Lab from Northwestern University, it's nightlab.js. They have some tools, timeline, story maps, and juxtapose, which were the ones I introduced them to from that space. We learned collection and curation tools like Zotero and Omeka, which they found really useful. They find Omeka really useful. We learned mapping tools, ArcGIS, Google Maps, and Neatline, which is a plugin for Omeka. Our toughest day was our minimal computing day. Although I will not spend a lot of time on minimal computing, I think minimal computing for me was a really essential part of the conversation around working with communities to give them the research that they need to do their own work. Because it allows us to create static sites that are not reliant on high bandwidth to do the work. It allows us to allow people to feel empowered by the computer and not scared of it by going straight to the source and using the terminal to do work. It's amazing how everyone felt like a programmer that day, and it was really, really painful, but it was also kind of joyful to see them really excited by computing, even if they were just basically doing what they would have done in a fancy interface. They were just talking directly to the computer through the command line, and that changed their sense of empowerment about what they were doing. So we learned Wax, which is basically an alternative to Omeka. It allows us to create digital exhibits, and Jekyll, which is a static site generator and allows us to create web pages of various kinds. Actually, Wax runs on Jekyll with what we call a gem. It runs on Ruby, a gem that allows it to create exhibits as well. Then we learned some textual analysis, putting bulk data. We talked a lot about the Digital Library of the Caribbean and the resources that are there and how they might find it useful, and using bulk data to tell stories about to understand patterns and see what are large pieces of information that they might get. And then we showed them how to do some 3D and augmented reality using a software called ZapWorks, which is really fun. And we will now have our little activity where I show you what they got to do. So these are some images we also learned the actual skills of digitization, which I didn't really include on that slide, but the pictures will show you that we have a book scanner, and we brought in a sample newspaper, like this is one of the current issues, and helped everyone kind of take a chance at learning how to use the scanner and learning how to set the dimensions, or learning how to use now the scanning technology is so great. And we have this book scanner. We were able to use all of this thanks to the grant funds that we were able to make these purchases and have these things available for our team to help us to do that. So this is some of us in the first week. On the top left is the first week learning all of those big ideas and trying to come up with research ideas. This grades a good picture. It represents almost everyone who participated in the training. So and then the two bottom pictures are of the training with the digitization. And then this last one was our attempt at augmented reality. And I will now ask you very quickly to see if you can participate in our fun. I think I might have closed it. By accident. Actually, I didn't. Hold on. Yeah. And you can see my screen, right? Yeah. New share. So if you can see the screen and you have your access to your phone and your camera and would like to participate, you can scan the barcode, the QR code right here to see what they were working on. This is my test project actually for the summer. And I will do a quick talk through with you. You will see a 3D object. You can place it anywhere in your room. We did some augmented reality. So you scan on the photo, and once you get it, you place the photograph anywhere in your room. And then it will land. You will see a beautiful landscape land in your living room or wherever you're watching this from, or your office. And once you click on that, I'm going to check the chat to see if we're having any fun with it. Once you place it, you'll see a little button saying place. You can touch the 3D tree and it'll take you to the next menu. So we were working around just using, if you're in it, it's a picture of the Botanic Gardens in Dominica, an aerial view, and we were just trying to place objects in there. And so when you click on the tree, you'll see other objects pop up, and then you can move around the room with them. So I hope you all were able to at least see some of that. Yeah. Great. Is everyone with me? Yeah. I can't see the chat. I'm trying to find it. Okay, great. Thank you, Lori. Okay, so let me just close out by returning us. I just wanted you to have a little experience of some of the fun that we were having, but I will wrap up the presentation with a few more prompts. and to ask us to think about what I learned and what questions I was thinking about during this time. What do we bring to the table as formal researchers? This is a question I often ask myself because so much of my work involves talking to people, even within Dominica, even within the tertiary education, higher education system, or education system more broadly, who are not focused on the process of research and more constantly interested in the products of research. Every time we do a project, we have a couple years ago, I sent students out in the community that I grew up to collect oral histories for part of our Caribbean project, which is a sustainable Caribbean futures project. And the community members kept asking them, what is this for? Like, what am I going to do with this? What is this? What are we doing this for? Every time we collect data for any project, whether it's a more kind of social policy project that we do on behalf of our partners in Dominica, or something that we generate that's more academic or even creative, we always get questions from local people about, why are we doing this? What is this for? How is this going to change my life, right? So you have to sort of constantly contend with that. Those of us working in these academic silos, for words of a better term, we're frequently talking to ourselves like we are today. It's not lost on me that the opportunities for us to have conversations about diversity do not always include the people for whom this diversity should matter the most. And what we always have to bring to the table is enthusiasm. We want to share the enthusiasm for the work, the enthusiasm and respect for the people whose lives make it possible for us to ask these questions and answer them, and for us to share the enthusiasm that we do have a certain level of optimism. Part of my work is this never-ending sort of almost fatalistic optimism that things can get better, things can be improved, and I keep trying every time, even in the face of every day there is some kind of bureaucratic or administrative or logistic thing that happens that reminds me of the reality of our lives and the difficulty of the world we're living in this particular moment, and every other moment in history, frankly. But there is a certain kind of radical optimism that I treat Create Caribbean with, that there is an enthusiasm that we have to bring, because we do, especially for the librarians in here, we do know history. We do know that for every story we have where there is, for all of the stories of marginalization, of oppression, we have the stories of the perseverance and the persistence, and we have those stories. These stories always go together in history, and they will go together in the future. And I think that's something that we have to try to find a way to communicate more clearly to the people for whom we work, all right, and on whose behalf we seek to access resources, to diversify our thinking, to create more opportunity. We have to do a better job of capturing and communicating that enthusiasm. What is our role in fostering diversity in local knowledge contexts? It's really important, especially in the summer intensive training context, for me to provide resources for people and then get out of the way. Our job isn't to get people on the bus and then drive the bus to tell them where we think a beautiful thing is. It's for us to bring up the bus, ask for a driver, and ride with them to the place they want to show us, right? I think it's really important for us to stay on the bus and be guided and provide them with any kind of technical support. We're the AAA of the bus, whatever it is, but we are on the bus as passengers, and we are simply there to help them if they have questions while they take us to where they want us to see and where they want us to go. That's what our role is in recording history, in whatever our types of forms of recording history and stories are. That's what our job is. It's not to come in and say, this is, and I know this is probably a tired thing we hear in many, many talks, that it doesn't actually work, but I am a citizen of Dominica. I am a patriot. I have spent my entire life learning there. This is where I went to school. This is where I make my life. This is where my parents live. This is where my grandparents live and died. This is my home. And as someone who is doing work with and for people who are also from my home, I have a stake to say that, yeah, sometimes even somebody like me needs to know when to shut up and go away and let them come back and ask for what they need if they need it, right? It's very important for us to not forget, not let our academic goals, our professional goals for tenure and whatever get in the way of people's actual lives. This is a really important part. How do we reconcile the desire to collect, preserve, analyze, and share with this need to regard and respect the nuance and opacity of local knowledges? This is my segue point, right? We all have, the work we do is critical. A lot of our stories would have been lost if it were not for the opportunities that we've had to participate in and create opportunities for preservation, for digital preservation, for grant writing and funding to be able to give to communities for this kind of work. Our work is important and we are a valuable part of the matrix of the network that makes these stories possible. But we also want to build trust by waiting to be invited, and some stories are not ours to capture. Some things are really to pass down through the generations, right? By word of mouth or other types of, physiological means. They are not for us. And we want to build trust and wait to be invited into those conversations by people who represent the communities that we want to serve. And how do we actually make room for diverse knowledges in our systems? I don't think it's our responsibility to do that. I think our responsibility is also to help people get back what belongs to them in terms of their, and this exists on a scale, of course, depending on what type of information and knowledge sharing we're talking about. We want to respect and repatriate our knowledges. Is it just our goal to preserve these things so future researchers can get to it? Or are we going to make sure that the people who are from this community can see, let me give you this collection of photos that we found in a box somewhere in New York, and it shows all of the people from Rosa Dominica in the 1960s. How are you going to make sure that in addition to scanning it and putting a link on Twitter and saying, oh, we found these great things, how are we making sure that the people from Roseau get to see those pictures and say, that's my cousin, or that's my aunt, or that's my grandmother? How are we repatriating what it is that we are working to bring? How are we creating these kind of exciting, fortunate exchanges or encounters with history for the people who are represented in the things that we are working hard to preserve? So these are my lessons that I am learning while I'm doing this work. I urge you to think about these questions for yourself and in the context of the work that you do. And I will stop here and thank you for listening to me for the last however long, and hope we have time for questions and engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thanks for folks doing the little reactions because we can see them on the screen. Thank you, Schuyler. That was a totally fantastic presentation. I am going to put some links in the chat. I'm not a host, so it looks like I can't send them to everyone, but hopefully one of the host folks can share the links out to Create Caribbean and the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective. And then folks, we've got, half an hour for questions and answers. So please share your questions in the Q&A. And since we don't have a question pending, I will go ahead and jump in with one. I loved how you spoke about the imaginative practices, dreaming, experimentation, happy accidents, things that started at a bar with a friend, serendipity, and the unlikely collaborations. There's been a good bit written about imaginative practices and the humanities and how we use the humanities to envision a better world in order to bring it into being. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your imaginative practices and your regular work.
Great question, Lori. I have a cousin who used to be, she's like my sister cousin, and she was my babysitter for a long time when I was little. And she complained every day we went to school. She's like, you are making me late because you daydream all the time. You know, I was the child who I was always staring at something. I was always daydreaming. She to this day, she talks about how I made her late every day because I would walk slow and watch everything and daydream everywhere. And I think about this as sort of the narrative of my life. I always, the wonder and the wandering, you know, in the very Langston Hughes way, where, you know, I wonder as I wander, right, was my way of moving through life as a child. And I think I have taken that sensibility with me in my life. I am very, my curiosity was always in a culture and a colonial space where curiosity and leisure were not necessarily seen as valuable things for Black people to have coming out of slavery, coming out of the experience of indentureship and all of those things. Our bodies and our minds were belonged to labor, right? And I think about leisure, I think about dreaming, I think about boredom, I think about ennui in general as not necessarily a privilege and a luxury for Caribbean people and Black people all over the world, but also as a right, that's our right, you know, as a repatriation of sort, as taking back, it's reparations for us to take back our time and our time to think and to meditate and to have enough time to process a thought. That's something that's always been valuable to me. It's because it's the way my brain works. And I've always been given that time in my own life. And probably one of the reasons why, even if I come from a very math and science heavy family, and I'm so attracted to computer science that I ended up in the humanities, right? Because our culture at the time did not give us a space to combine or think about both as possible together, but always sort of in these kind of partitions in parallel spaces. So yeah, I think, of course, about it from a humanities perspective, I am very, very biased. And I think humanities people are smarter than other people. And it's like they really don't know what's going on in the world until they have to come talk to us about, you know, what's happened. I'm very, very, you know, very much a snob about that. And also because we're right every time, you know, we can't, this is why when the difficult decisions are happening and the world is falling apart, the CNNs and the MSNBCs call on the historians to come to the news, right? But also at the very level of my students thinking, at the very level of getting my students to be comfortable with even computer science students or students coming from a very draconian kind of colonial classroom model, for them to just answer a question in class or attempt something because they're afraid they might get the answer wrong. That is such a challenge still in 2022 for me in a Caribbean classroom, that it really does matter for us to make time for dreaming, for us to make time for experimentation. It's one of the reasons why in my classroom, I still tell students to not ask me about grades while I honor the right. I try to get them to stop thinking about what they're doing this for and think about whether they're having a good time thinking about the thing, right? So I want to answer the question and say about the humanities, but I also want to be very specific for our context and the Caribbean context and say, I think part of my goal around this is not about just generating things for the humanities thinking as producing a better world, but as us, as Caribbean people reclaiming our right to be, right? It's our right to think and a right to have ideas and have those ideas spin into things that are not for the final product of someone else's profit, for the right to think in the process of doing things. And probably that one doesn't work out and we have the opportunity to try something else, right? I think that is for me a more kind of like a next level of that for me in the more specific space that we're working.
Yeah, that is a great answer. So folks, I have a ton of, oh good, other people are asking questions because I have a ton. And I think you can read that. I'll read it in case someone doesn't. So another question is thanking Schuyler for the keynote. It's from a PhD candidate at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, interested in building trust in Caribbean communities, as well as collecting stories of survival and healing through oral archives. And asking, can you talk more about what you or your students have found in regard to opacity when recording?
Okay, that's a very good question. Good luck as you work on your PhD. I always think about opacity as my thinking about opacity originates with Edward Glissant's kind of idea about leaving things out as part of the theoretical imperative in Caribbean studies. I also think about opacity as a space for, honoring ourselves, right? I think we don't have to give all of ourselves away to prove that we have a right to be here. And this is how I treat it in research. I will give an analogy to our current events and then come back to this specific question about oral histories. Every time there's police brutality and a Black person or brown person gets killed by police in the United States, there is a certain type of portrayal or insistence on profiling from the communities, the victims' communities, profiling that person as someone who did not deserve to die, or making an extra case for that person is a good person, right? This has been a narrative of respectability that has come from marginalized communities everywhere in the world, including the Caribbean. We don't air our dirty laundry. It is the reason why I want to remember the year now, 74, when Jamaica Kincaid first started thinking about writing A Small Place, Antiguans got really, really upset at the publication of that essay and said, you shame us. We're not supposed to talk about this. Even if most of it was actually what was really happening. We have all of these examples of ways that we are not supposed to talk bad about ourselves in public, right? We are not supposed to, and we are also supposed to present the best of ourselves in public. But I also see opacity as our right not to do that, or not to have to explain ourselves at all in order to be worthy of being in any space we occupy, including spaces that are historically ours and were occupied or stolen or colonized, right? And so that's how I treat the issues with oral history. We have a right to our privacy, and we have a right to our desire to not communicate either our emotional states or our particular stories around that. I think around the issue of oral histories, when my students went into the field, some of our students, I was not in Dominica at the time they went into my community. I was kind of happy about that because I think more people would have been inclined to speak to us very willingly if I was present, because I'm pretty well. I was always involved in my community from very young, and so I'm pretty well known. But when sending my students out without the me attached to them, they had to do that extra work of building trust. Some of them were from that community and could help with that, but they also had to learn how to articulate what they were trying to accomplish. And I think giving them skills about the ethics and care and learning when to accept no for an answer was a big part of my training for that. When and how to ask follow-up questions or not to ask follow-up questions, and reading body language, and those things are very important. Probing always leads to disaster. So I think in that case, I relied on my students. I trusted my students with the training that they had received from me. And I also kind of helped them learn how to rely on local knowledge, including the members of the group who were from that community, using that local knowledge to build relationship and to build trust, but also respecting when someone had had enough. And that is something that I don't know always that we talk about it a lot, and it's written a lot in the research around oral history, that people know that they should do it, but what it looks like in the action is not really well, it's not really well done, because when you see the final oral histories or you listen to them, you hear the follow-up question or you hear the pause waiting for it. And even in those examples, I think we still have a bit of work to do as a community of scholars who goes into that community. So I don't know if this answers your question, but it does it does help me think about that person's right to not have to explain themselves to be here. That's my desire to know. That's not their desire, right? And writing that into the process. I think about process writing. I'm working on something right now as part of the CDSC where process writing is really important to me. Writing about you as the researcher, writing about the process of that moment of stopping and what that means for you and within the context of what the broader questions you were asking. So I hope that helps. I see another question in the chat. See, Laurie is.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to keep reading them, but I'll do that just because that's how we started. So the chat comment is, I really enjoyed using the Night Lab tools, and I'm looking forward to checking out the other tools that you chose to teach and use in the DH Intensive program. How did you pick these tools? And also thanking you for a wonderful presentation.
Great, thank you. Oh, so how do I pick these tools? I spend a lot of time daydreaming and playing around with tools myself. I started by saying the only right to research I was interested in when I built Create Caribbean was mine. I wanted to have a space where I could do work. I don't get to do that much of any at all anymore, to spend any time doing any fun things. But I used to have a time when I played around a lot with all of the tools. Everything that I teach, I use. Everything that I have been using Zotero since Zotero was beta, and I actually was just one of the beta testers of the mobile Zotero, which is coming soon. The app is going to be amazing. It's great. It is. I find tools a lot in my community of scholars. I try to stay. Programming Historian is a really great site, and it exists in multiple languages: French, Spanish, Russian. A few more that I'm missing. I think there are many languages of translation for the Programming Historian project, where a lot of, not only do you get introduced to new tools, but you get tutorials on how to use them. Most of the things that I talked about today, you can probably get a tutorial on there. It's amazing. So if you're looking to teach some of these tools or to learn them for yourself, that's a great place to learn them. Some of these tools were actually built with us in mind. So Wax and Jekyll were developed, well, Jekyll not as much, but Wax was certainly developed for the DH, within the DH community and for the type of work that we do. My colleague and friend Alex Hill is one of the people who has worked quite ardently on that, and also on Neatline, which came from the Scholars Lab at UVA. So Neatline was a plugin for Omeka. Omeka came from George Mason. And so all of these are existing in communities of scholars who are saying, I teach and research in these fields, and I want to think about a tool that will help me to, one, improve my methodology for my research, but also to help me become a better teacher. And so those things are always working together in the space that we work. And so that's why you see Omeka has gone through so many changes. And I used to use Omeka at the beginning for everything because it was open source and open access. I could modify and I could use for free. But it came up to a point where as Create Caribbean grew, my needs grew, and now I have to use Jekyll because it gives me a little more flexibility and it takes up less space. And it allows me to work from my community where broadband internet is not always consistent. And this is something I can use with no internet at all. So all of these things take shape around our needs. Again, local knowledge, local needs, but also around staying in community and connection with the people who are doing the work and share the values that you believe in as well.
And someone should be sharing some of these links shortly with folks. So we have another thank you for a wonderful presentation, and another thanking you for another wonderful presentation, and sharing that this reminds of Tricia Hersey's new book called Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto, and then a question of how does the work you do address epistemicide?
Okay, I saw the link for that, and while I'm just getting used to the term, I know about the Rest is Resistance book, and I'm looking forward to it. But I am not as familiar with the term epistemicide. But from what I understand about it, I will say this. This is part of intuitively, I think it's really a constant place of what I would say internal conflict for me, where I don't want us to become the part of the problem we're trying to solve, right? I think about my work as not making the lives of people who I care about more difficult or more troublesome or more exposed or vulnerable as a result of my desire to do this work. In any given moment and in any given day, I start a project and it doesn't feel right in my body, I'm not doing it anymore. And in my body, I mean that the people who raised me in that block or in that community, and by people, I mean the whole neighborhood, are feeling not right about something that can be done by this information, I'm going to stop and not do it or reassess what I'm doing. That's really important to me. And I always say, Great Caribbean is a family business, and my whole family is the community. Despite the way that my life has changed so much by this adventure that I have taken on, by this accidental adventure, it still remains a personal project, a passion project, and a family business. And if my family and my people are not right, I'm not going to be right doing it, and I can stop at any time. That's how I can respond right now without having read as much upon it. But thanks for the link. I already bookmarked it so I can read after this because I'm super interested in it. But I do see the point, and I do have that fear sometimes about our attempts. And even as we got this Mellon grant, it's something my colleagues and I do think about. What we want to make sure we are constantly talking about making sure that the good we said we were going to do with this money is the good we're actually going to do. We want to make sure that we're not causing harm or silencing stories that need to be told or airing people's stories that are none of our business to tell. All of those things are part of our care that we're applying to how we do work on this grant as part of this collective. It's something that we are all committed to as part of our shared values. So I hope that kind of responds to what your understanding of it is, and I certainly will read up more.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I love how so much of everything that you've spoken about weaves in, respect, cultural humility in general, how will we call people in, and how do we respect boundaries and understand? And that's a really important part of everything that we need to be doing and learning. And so it's wonderful to have you here sharing with us. So we have another question on when moving to engage with careers in digital humanities and preservation, how far can I take my creative praxis and imagination in my practice within the limits of a career? So this is from someone finishing an MA in English, but the temptation of further studies and just archival library studies to get the skills and training versus finances or creating my own ways of learning and experiences.
Wow, okay. That's a big question. Good luck on your journey. I'm happy. I will share my email in the chat and you can send me an email and maybe have a follow-up conversation. I will tell people that I'm worried to give career advice. When I quit my job in the United States and moved to Dominica with no job, I was in my third year on the tenure track at liberal arts college in the DC area. And everybody was worried that I needed to go to a therapist or more when I did that in 2013. I had been planning it for a long time and didn't really tell anybody that I was going to make a big cut like that. I gave them the impression that I was kind of going to take a time off, a sabbatical, a research year or whatever. That's the benefit of working in a field that no one in your family has really worked in before, that you get to just make stuff up and they're like, okay, sure, that's what's happening. So I tell you the story because it's the most outrageous thing. I got a tenure track job before I even graduated from my PhD and I quit and I went to my house because the United States was not a place that I was finding compatible with my biological clock because of winter. I did not like working in the context that I was working at the time, and I wanted to do more work with the people where I'm from. And I quit my job. And so fast forward 9 years, this is not what happens to most people who make this choice. And this is a road that, like I said, with little to no funding, it was incredibly difficult for a period of time, right? I literally started my life all over. Was the best decision I ever made. I will make it again, but it's not for everyone. But I do think that it is important for you to understand that an academic career is a career that you are trying to make a decision about your labor and where you find your labor valuable, and also where you will be able to make a comfortable life for yourself. Do not discount the importance of making sure that you have your basic needs met. And your basic needs not only include housing and food and shelter, but you want to be able to be at peace in your body when you go to work. That's an important part of it. Where in the matrix of the things that you're considering right now is going to make you feel that? Yes, the resistance part is a big part of this conversation, but also where are you going to feel at peace when you go to work? That's very hard for me to tell anyone working anywhere right now, because life is hard, and I am so grateful that I get to work largely for myself right now. But I do think you might want to if you are thinking about it, you might want to take a break and see what else while working or applying for a job. You can try to work with collaborate on a project or two with colleagues, see if you can work on a very specific project and see how that can leverage you into your into archival or library studies. I also have a degree in literature. Okay, I have all my degrees in literature, and I write code now, and I have not taken a single computer science class. So a lot of the things that you think you need to necessarily go back to school for are not necessarily things that you need to go back to a formal degree to learn. If you have your master's in a humanities degree, like I said, we're the best. You already know how to learn, and you can make courses accessible to yourself in non-traditional ways, save yourself a lot of money and a lot of time by doing coursework in alternate ways to help you get where you need to go. So I don't necessarily think that, and I don't want to, certainly, I am the queen of the stand of librarians. I don't want to discount the meticulous work that librarians do and archival work and so on. But I think that there are different points of entry into the profession that don't necessarily always include sacrificing, especially if you come from a community of people or for a background where finances and you might be first generation or from a marginal group, or have some reason where you are concerned about. I mean, you don't even need any of these anymore. Inflation is real, where money's hard to come by and work is important because everything is expensive. You might need to consider an alternate way. So just keep that on the burner, but I'm welcome to talk to you some more about that off the grid if you would like that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's super wonderful and very generous of you to offer for contacting people. So we have another question that's come in. You mentioned Jamaica Kincaid. Could you talk a bit more about some of the people and work who have most inspired you over the course of your career? Who has most inspired you, and how and why?
It's so funny that Jamaica Kincaid comes up every time, because she's sort of my literary mother, And recently I started a blog, a newsletter called Kincaid's Garden, and then right away she ended up in a mess at Harvard, and I was brokenhearted. And then I had to say, all our gods come back to earth one day, and I had a little come to Jesus meeting with Jamaica Kincaid, but she is still one of my main literary and cultural influences. People who have made an impact on my work and my influences. I never get that question, Lori. Thank you. Nobody asked me that. I think besides Jamaica Kincaid, I have learned a lot from George Lamming. As a scholar, my dissertation was inspired by many of the questions that he raised in A Pleasures of Exile, his collection of essays. And I think he was such a distinguished person. He was such a quiet person who daydreamed all the time in his work, you could tell. And he's one of my great influences, one of the smartest people in writing, and one of the kindest people I've ever met, who was so encouraging, and who wrote a lot about the kind of work that I want to do in terms of literary history. As far as my work is inspired by the people who raised me. My grandparents, particularly both paternal and maternal, have a lot. I come from a family where history and genealogy and those conversations, and my family, particularly my paternal family, was always quite involved in progressive movements, as early as anti-colonial and independence movements in the 1960s in the Caribbean. And so that has always been front and center in my life, and I've always been pushed to do this work. I come from a household where, you know, in a life of scarcity, to some extent, my mom always found money to buy books. And books are expensive. Listen, as a grown-up, it's like, you know what, this is a big deal. So these are my influences, I would say. Of course, like, you know, all of the greats and so on, but some of my teachers are also some of the greatest influences I have. I have a lot of great teachers all the way from primary school, but certainly Merle Collins and Mary Helen Washington have been really big influences in my thinking. I worked with Mary Helen Washington for a long time as a research assistant, and Merle Collins was also on my committee and asked me a big important question that really shaped the way of my career. She asked me one time, where are the people in this thing that you're writing about? And it's, you know, it's always with me everywhere I go. I appreciate her and her teaching and her work so much. So yeah, that's a summary of some of the people.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So we're running almost to the end of time. We do have one question left, which is, what is your vision for the, or we have one question right now, and I think it's the last we'll have time for. What is your vision for the legacy of your work in Create Caribbean?
Ooh, I'm getting like big grown-up questions today. Thanks for that question. I want my students, we have a little joke at Create Caribbean, it's always sort of our tagline, to think it all the way through. I always want my students to finish their thoughts. This is back to the question about thinking and humanities and making time to dream and experiment. I want all of my students to be free to think and to dream, and to finish their thoughts all the way to the end about what's possible for them. I think a lot of the time we stop thinking because we are afraid. We stop thinking because we are under-resourced. We stop thinking because we are upset or angry or get just depressed by the state of the world. We stop thinking, we stop feeling, we stop dreaming at that point when the thing gets hard. And this is not a generational thing. I know people say that every new generation, but we all do it. Every time we have a good idea and a big idea, we stop because, you know, tenure clock, or I don't have time, or we stop thinking. And I want us to think it all the way through. I think for me, that will be my legacy, to finish your thought till the moment of possibility, where you see the end of what you're dreaming, right? Always for me, that's my legacy. I want people to think about, what if it does work out, right? What if you do get everything you ask for? What if you had all of the things that you need to make this possible? What then, right? And then go back and make it possible for yourself. It's something that I share with my students all the time, you know, because they're late adolescents for the most part, and they always need that extra encouragement. But I also feel like with my community partners, this is becoming more and more of the narrative, because everybody comes so tired and so depressed. We've been trying all kinds of things to do this little project and it wouldn't work. Well, what if it did? Tell me what you would do. Tell me what the best thing you could make would happen if you just finished that dream. Will you stop being tired for 5 minutes and let yourself be happy about the possibility of a thing. That for me is the legacy. And I say this as somebody who very personally, for both very, very personal reasons that I'm keeping my opacity for this, I was afraid to dream for a long time. As much of the daydreaming I did, none of that was centering around me and my own dreams. It was always about making things possible for other people, and less so for myself. And I learned that Create Caribbean helped me to learn that for myself. It was in the doing and helping my students that I learned to prioritize that for myself and give myself a lot of time and space and possibility for my own dreams. Create Caribbean being just one of them, right? And so it is that radical optimism does matter. It does matter to keep it, and that's what I think I want my legacy and the work of Create Caribbean to be.
That is a fantastic answer. Yeah, I mean, bringing it back to radical optimism, and yeah, how do we keep this hope inside ourselves? And then I am going to start asking people, tell me the best thing that will happen if you finish your dream. Because that's a great question to frame so much of our collaborative work and just how we envision for the future. So we have 3 minutes left, but we do not have further questions. And I think another question might put us over. So I'd just like to thank everyone so much for being here. Dr. Schuyler Esprit, thank you so much for this. It's absolutely beautiful. Folks, look out for the recording. Thank you again. Thanks, CRL, for hosting this.
Thank you, everyone.